Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Bliski istok je decenijama od strateškog značaja za Sjedinjene Američke Države. Tu se nalaze neki od najvećih američkih vojnih baza. Tim zemljama se prodaju najnapredniji američki odbrambeni sistemi i u tom regionu američke kompanije decenijama crpe jeftinu naftu koja pokreće američku ekonomiju. Ali posljednjih godina sve se više govori kako Bliski istok gubi svoju stratešku važnost i kako se Washington okreće Aziji s ciljem kontriranja kineskoj dominaciji. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo američku vanjsku politiku prema Bliskom istoku. Razgovaramo i o novim taborima i previranjima koja definišu današnje političke odnose u tom dijelu svijeta. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo uvodni prilog o najnovim dešavanjima u tom dijelu svijeta. Idemo sada do Istanbula gdje se nalazi Talip Küçükcan, viši saradnik na istraživačkom centru kanala TRT World. Talip, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now let me start by asking you, to what extent have America's relations with Muslim countries deteriorated over the past 4 years during Donald Trump's presidency, and why has Washington grown closer to some countries in the Middle East at the expense of other much older allies such as Turkey?
Well, generally speaking, when you look at the American administration under Trump, we see that the relations have really deteriorated to a large scale. That is the general observation, because I would just remind you and the audience that when Trump came to power, the first, I think, decree he signed was to stop some Muslims coming to America. I think 6-7 countries were included in the list. So you can see that right from the beginning of his administration, he had a negative attitude towards the Muslim world. And of course, when you look at the general pattern, I think there are some exceptions, especially towards the Gulf countries. The Trump administration developed closer relations with the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, where Trump has been hosted by the king. And also we know that he has later on had very close relations with Mohammed bin Salman. And also the other Gulf countries joined the club. I think there are some reasons with regard to the regional ambitions of the United States of America and its plans. Now, what we can see today is that there is a new, I think, initiative to push these countries closer to Israel, to recognize Israel and to normalize the relations. And I think this is the main reason why Trump administration had closer ties with the regimes in the Middle East, which saw Israel in a positive light, I would say. And of course, the energy resources, security issues are also important. But the fundamental issue for the United States of America in the Middle East is, I think, protection of Israel, or the Israeli security, because Israel is seen, is not recognized by many surrounding countries in the region. America has been pushing the regimes in the region to recognize Israel. As you would remember also, the Trump administration moved the embassy to Jerusalem. I think this is yet another move which was not accepted by Turkey and other regional countries, including Iran. So you can see that there are some reasons. I think the Israeli issue plays a major role. Secondly, the energy issues and the export of the weapons to these countries play also a major role. When it comes to Turkey, I think when you look at Turkey and U.S. relations under Trump administrations, we can see on the leadership level there is some sort of chemistry between the Turkish leadership and Trump. But when we look at the policies with regard to Syria, for example, there is a divergence. With regard to the supporting some of the groups in northern Syria, again, there is a huge difference between Turkey and the United States of America, because U.S. Has been supporting PYD and YPG. These are the PKK offshoot groups. Turkey sees them as terrorist organizations, and Turkey sees them as a threat to its security. I think these are some of the issues that we can mention. Of course, Turkey's relations with Russia became closer simply because of the Syrian case, because when the United States of America withdrew from Syria, Russia came in as an important player and actor, and Turkey had no option but to talk to Russia in order to resolve the issues on the ground, because Turkey has a long border with Syria and it cannot remain indifferent to what's happening in northern Syria, because there is no central government, very strong central government, there is no authority, and there are many non-state actors emerging in the region, and Turkey had to respond to these challenges, right, which the United States of America did not really want Turkey to have that.
Now, Mr. Talib, there has been a lot of UAE-funded lobbying in Washington, D.C. since the Saudi Emirati blockade of Qatar began in 2016. Now, Turkey has openly sided with Doha from the very beginning. Why do the Emirates and Saudi Arabia perceive Qatar and Turkey as an enemy? And how deeply entrenched are these two blocs in the Middle East?
I believe that the issue started among the Gulf countries before Turkey entered into the picture. You would remember that Qatar was isolated by the, let's say, big countries in the region, led by Saudi Arabia and UAE, and Qatar needed help and assistance. Turkey just came into the play on that moment. Before that, Turkey was not involved in the discussions and debates within the Gulf countries. I think that is very clear. And when Qatar approached Turkey to have closer relations, which Turkey had actually, not only with Qatar, Turkey had very good relations with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all other Gulf countries, because Turkey followed since the beginning of AK Party administration since 2002 very close relations with those, I think, countries, and established not only close relations on the leadership level, but also on the economic issues as well. And when Qatar needed this help, Turkey just sided with Qatar, because Turkey believes that Qatar should not be isolated, that will be not in the interest of the Arab world, that is not going to be in the interest of the Muslim world. Therefore, Turkey sided with Qatar. And I think when we look at a little bit the background of the issues, we can also see that UAE has been supporting the opposition groups in Turkey for many months and years, especially after the Arab Spring. You remember that during the Arab Spring events, Turkey supported people on the street, people that wanted to have a transition, a democratic transition. This was the beginning of the, I think, souring of relations between Turkey and the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And the UAE is a very authoritarian regime. There is no accountability, there is no transparency. And what we see these days that UAE is leading the Arab-Israeli rapprochement. And I think you can see the reasons why Turkey has been supporting Qatar in that sense. Qatar is also supported by Iran during the, I think, crisis. Right. So we can see that there is a a clear, I think, division among the Arab world with regard to fundamental issues in the region. It seems that Turkey's views are much closer to the Qatari government and administration.
Now, Mr. Talib, would you agree that Donald Trump, over the past 4 years, has in some way empowered populist leaders around the world and contributed to the mainstreaming of Islamophobia? And what repercussions will this have on Muslim minorities living in, say, France or the United States of America?
Well, there is no doubt that the Trump administration really gave up on the idea of promoting democracy, human rights, and equality all over the world. America used to lead such sort of initiatives in the world. But with Trump, what we have seen that American society and American administration isolated itself from the rest of the world. Remember the motto that the Trump administration and Trump himself used, America first. That means the rest of the world is not their concern. And also, as I reminded you, the Trump administration signed the first degree against the entrance of Muslims into the country. So that played a major role in terms of giving ammunition to those people who are against Islam, who are against Muslims. But we should also acknowledge that the Islamophobia or populism existed before the Trump administration. But Trump administration has, I think, empowered those people who are having the same opinion. And of course, when American administration tolerates Islamophobic discourse and practices, that would have been, I think, taken as an example by many other countries. And also, Trump administration did not react Islamophobic hate crimes. And also, Trump had very good relations with some of the populist leaders all around the world. And that also played a role for the rise of Islamophobia. And what we see in France, I think, is a reflection of it, but also some other countries in Europe, we see a similar trend. According to the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is based in Vienna and supported by the European Union, all the data indicates that Muslims are discriminated, Muslims are becoming victims of the hate crimes and hate speech. I think Trump had some responsibility. And you can see what's happening in China, what's happening in India. I think there are similar issues. And the American administration used to be much tougher on these violations. But Trump administrations, to a large extent, I think, kept silence on the violation of freedom of religion as far as Muslims are concerned.
Right. Mr. Talib Küçükcan, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Zemlje Bliskog istoka su među najvećim kupcima oružja, pretežno od zapadnih proizvođača. Prema podacima Štokholmskog instituta za mirovne studije, Saudijska Arabija je prošle godine bila najveći uvoznik oružja u svijetu. Više detalja u grafici koja slijedi. Nastavljamo analizirati američku vanjsku politiku prema Bliskom istoku. Naš naredni gost je Peter Mendeville, profesor međunarodnih odnosa na George Mason Universitetu. Peter, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, back in 2008, when President Barack Obama delivered his famous speech in Cairo, many talked about a new beginning with the Muslim world. There was a lot of enthusiasm for a new beginning. So why hasn't much of that materialized over the years?
Hi, Harun. It's great to be with you today. Thank you. So President Obama's speech in Cairo in 2009 was exciting to many Muslims around the world because it outlined an incredibly ambitious agenda to fundamentally change aspects of U.S. foreign policy, including such things as shifting away from a focus on terrorism and how the U.S. views Muslims, an effort to take democratization seriously in the Middle East, the idea of possibly beginning to normalize relations with Iran, some really fundamentally different ways of thinking about the role of the United States in the world, including trying to achieve peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think the problem is that there was very little a follow-up on this agenda. Instead, the aftermath of the Cairo speech involved activities such as appointing diplomats whose job it was to go around the Muslim world and talk to people about things like education and research and entrepreneurship. So people who heard the speech got excited about a seeming new fundamental revolutionary even direction in US foreign policy, but very little of this came to pass. And I think that's why we had trouble following up on the enormous potential and promise of that speech.
Now, critics have harangued the Trump doctrine in the Middle East as an even hastier surrender of America's hegemony that has defined the regional order since the 1970s. Do you agree with such an assessment? Or has American interest in that region already been steadily declining over the past years?
Yeah, I actually think the Middle East is a little bit of an exception to what is otherwise correctly characterized as a U.S. withdrawal from the world. We obviously see the Trump administration expressing enormous skepticism about the role of the United States in many multilateral spaces, such as the United Nations, NATO, U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Accord, for example. In the Middle East, however, I think the inclination of the Trump administration has actually been to try to turn the clocks back to a time when the United States was more assertive in its role in the region. And I think we see this very clearly in the way that the US relationship with Saudi Arabia has evolved under the Trump administration. And particularly the idea that between the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump, you have two men that see Iran as a fundamental existential threat. And both of them want to take a very hard line. I think the Saudis have been looking for the United States to come back and put in place something like a security order enforced by Washington, D.C. The problem, and this is where the second part of your question becomes relevant, the problem is that U.S. interests in the Middle East have fundamentally changed over the last 20 years.
In what sense?
Well, from the point of view of energy, obviously the United States is far less reliant on oil from this region. Geopolitically, the Middle East played a very important role for U.S. security interests with respect to the Soviet Union in terms of the strategic relationships that Washington had with places like Cairo and Riyadh and Tel Aviv. So that broader global context is different. The one thing that I think has remained constant over the last 20 years is very important security and intelligence sharing arrangements that Washington has with, for example, the Saudis that have been a crucial part of U.S. efforts to combat terrorism around the world. I think they're trying to rebuild the substance of a firm relationship, the U.S. and Riyadh and other key allies around the question of Iran. But I think we have to face the reality that the basic contours of the American calculus in the Middle East have changed significantly.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have studied Saudi Arabia for many years. So far as Washington is concerned, will the Saudis continue to retain their added value compared to other Gulf states once oil loses its centrality to U.S. economic interests? In other words, despite all their rifts, is Riyadh an ally worth having and keeping?
I think The challenge that the United States faces right now is precisely to identify and negotiate a new terms of reference for the US-Saudi relationship, which for many decades was based on this ideal of trading oil for security, particularly, as I mentioned, in the context of the Cold War. This basic calculus has now changed. I mentioned the idea that there's a lot of security cooperation and intelligence sharing around terrorism, and to some extent, there's an aspect of the US-Saudi relationship. You know, we can borrow a metaphor from banking and finance. When we talk about certain banks being too big to fail, there's a certain sense in which Saudi Arabia's enormous role in terms of its resources, its ability to project political influence and to even organize many aspects of the geopolitics of the Middle East, that is not going to change. So Washington can never afford to not have a working relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think the question is rather whether this is a fundamentally strategic relationship or whether this is more of a transactional relationship where Washington and Riyadh can do business with each other on issues that matter to both of them, and where Washington in particular can, I think, help a young and emerging leader in the form of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to navigate and exert his enormous influence in ways that are responsible and don't lead to regional instability.
Now, Peter, the biggest issue in the Middle East from the 1990s up to the 9/11 attacks was the question of democratization and the compatibility of Islam, democracy, and human rights. However, more recently, I have a feeling that these topics are being jettisoned in favor of security, and that authoritarian strongmen are once again the preferred choice for the West, from Mohammed bin Salman to Mohammed bin Zayed. Is it simply easier doing business with a single head of state instead of a parliament? Or is it that old story that elections will bring Islamists to power?
Yes, you're right. We do seem to be returning to bad habits. And this issue of democratization in the Middle East and taking human rights seriously is another one where Donald Trump and Mohammed bin Salman have seen eye to eye. Of course, in the view of the Saudi royal family, this is an existential issue. If democracy takes root and spreads across the region, then it fundamentally threatens their political power.
Right.
And so I think that as much as Trump, in cooperation with Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman, have been looking to roll back the tide and the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, there's a basic fundamental reality that all of these players will have to face, which is the fact that the basic socioeconomic tensions and contradictions that were the cause of the Arab uprisings in 2010 and 2011, and we shouldn't forget that we saw a second wave of this last year in places like Algeria and Iraq and Sudan. Those basic social economic contradictions are still there, and it's only a matter of time before those pressures build up again. So you can try to push back and roll back the idea that citizens of the Arab world want governments that are accountable and effective, but you can't deny these basic underlying tensions that will continue to return and cause tensions. The question then is, how will these governments respond the next time the Arab uprisings happen?
Right. Peter Mandeville, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Harun. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Iako je danas fokus Washingtona na rastući kineski utjecaj u Aziji, Bliski istok će i dalje zadržati svoj značaj. U protekle 4 godine Donald Trump je oslabio diplomatske i institucionalne veze sa zemljama Bliskog istoka i zamijenio ih ličnim i porodičnim vezama. Američki generali su negodovali zbog toga, a posljedice već su vidljive. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pogledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.